So now we kind of move to the Northern Hemisphere and some Northern Hemisphere thinking, which is globally informed. And as I mentioned before in the introduction, Sacha's work has been quite inspiring, and the insights that he brings to questions of sustainability and imagination have been really influential and continue to be, for me, a guiding light in some of the ways we might think about these questions of sustainability, hopefulness, imagination, and where we get to next. As I mentioned before, Sacha is joining us from Germany. He was a founding coordinator of the international network Cultura 21, Cultural Fieldworks from Sustainability, and board member of the research network Sociology of the Arts at the European Sociological Association. His research the focus of his research is in the arts, culture, urban development, and queer sexual cultures in relation to the cultural dimension of sustainability. And he's intervened at over 130 events in 33 countries. We are absolutely so privileged and thrilled to have you with us, Sacha, particularly at the time zone that you're in at the moment, and welcome you.
Thanks a lot, Marianne. I'm sorry for the difficulty to connect. I'm now connected through a phone which has very little bandwidth, so I might again be disconnected at any time. So in case this collapses again, I'm really sorry. It's just a kind of quickly made alternative with connected through USB. I don't know how long it will work. So, but you hear me? It's working now. Okay, great.
Yeah,
so
it's
I
great.
will. Okay, great. Let's cross fingers and hope it works at least for as long as possible. I'm going to share my screen for the slides, and then I will try to get started with my presentation. Getting this full screen. Just full screen. So yes, so I want to share a few things around notions of complexity, around imaginaries. You just mentioned imagination, and specific understanding of sustainability, which has been called procedural sustainability. It's a lot of different things. So let's see how little or how much I can quickly go through a number of those ideas and notions. So first, to start with, I want to mention the image we have usually when we think of sustainability. The most widespread one you find in international organizations is and around the world is the idea that sustainability would be made of some kind of pillars, like some kind of temple with different pillars that would just stand next to each other, and the whole building would depend on them, but you still have a very separated kind of thinking, which is bringing this together. Other people talk about dimensions of sustainability, and this already is more helpful because dimensions, those who look into it in terms of the dimensions tend to have a more integrated view. So this is already maybe a first step to think about it, to try to go away from this imagination of pillars of sustainability. And not to think either of sustainability as a plurality, also, plurality of ecologies, nor about just a unity, but this notion of plurality, which is both united and complex at the same time. So that's the first notion. And a second notion quickly is, I mentioned procedural sustainability in the field of people doing sustainability research, and also in the political and activist approaches to sustainability. There are kind of three different ways to define it. The most widespread one is a universalist approach. So when you think about the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, you think about some kind of other work being done in international organizations. You think about kind of minimum agreements that one tries to find across the planets, and which have a kind of universalist background or universalist idea. One can also call it a thin sustainability because it's only a very thin layer of common agreements. Another approach to sustainability, another way to define it, which is, I think, much more interesting for us, is the so-called procedural approach. So that means that sustainability is there the emergent property of a discussion about desired futures. So it emerges in a societal field of negotiations, of search, of conversations, etc., etc. And it's not some kind of universal basis that that is there, so to say. So this is an approach that has been especially defended by people like, for example, John Robinson in Canada, who has been working a lot on that. And finally, there is another set of definitions which see sustainability as something which is ambiguous and whose value lies in its ambiguity. A bit like some other great notions that have been discussed, like democracy, like freedom, and some other notions which are nebulous ideas, which are inherently vague and which actually have a power through their vagueness, because they offer an arena for conversations through their ambiguity. So some people actually defend this ambiguity. So I would suggest that we look especially at the second and third one, procedural and ambiguous, and beware of the universalist or of remaining within the universalist thin approach to sustainability. Another short point is about when we think about the current polycrisis we are living through. Polycrisis, notion from Edgar Morin, to talk about the many different dimensions, interconnected dimensions of unsustainable development. To see that this is not just a crisis of wrong values that would just need to be replaced by right or proper values. That would be a bit too simple, but that it also has to do, and that's something that I've been convinced about more and more in recent years, it has a lot to do with the failures of a modern social imaginary, which is very present in so-called sustainable development approaches, which is an imaginary of planning and control, which tries to mistake sustainable developments for some kind of engineered or regimented roadmap to more sustainable development. So this is connected to a need to look into the complexity, to look into the qualitative or general complexity of the polycrisis, and to work with the uncertainty. So this connects to the notion of a culture of complexity or aesthetics of complexity, which I will try to say a few words about now, but it's very, very short. I really recommend you look some of the texts about it to get more into it. So, but anyway, in this case, sustainability is really part of this this procedural approach, a kind of generative journey of discovery of potentially desirable futures, which allows the democratic emergence of plural alternative futures for those who are involved in specific, always in a specific context. So following that approach, John Robinson and David Maggs in Canada were arguing quite many times with the slogan, especially coming from things like the IPCC and being frustrated with a lack of advancement through those kind of approaches. They kind of held the slogan, do not prove the world more real, but prove the world more imaginary, which has to do with working with uncertainty, with acknowledging that nobody knows the story of sustainability, that we are collectively co-creating it and exploring it. So to work with inherent unpredictability, to work with emergence and emerging phenomena, to work also with partial views and with sharing different partial views and having what I would call a kind of candid transdisciplinarity, which of course is informed by science and other forms of knowing across societies, but which has a kind of candid approach to them. And finally, working with desires and imaginations. So what I would like to do, and I will do it this also very shortly because of our short time frame, but to when we think about the importance of imagination and imaginaries, and I think it's useful to do a little bit of conceptual clarification between the two. So when we talk about imagination, we are talking about an individual and social, a perceptive and a creative process by which we shape realities in our encounters with the world. So this is something which is at play in perception, which gives forms to sensory intuitions, and which is also making present that which is absent. So it's of course it relates to fantasy, but it's not just fantasy. It's actually a sensitivity to the possible shapes of one's environment. So this is why the author I mentioned there, Merleau-Ponty, is quite useful, because it has a lot to do with the understandings that came from phenomenology, to relate to the possible shapes that exists in one's environments. So this process of imagination is actually at the very basis of the possibility of any action, and also at the active and at the organizational heart of social and political reality. So that's in short about the process of imagination. And next to that, we have the imaginary in the singular, or the imaginaries in the plural. One can think of individual and especially of social imaginary. And this is more like a matrix, one could say, a pattern set of shared images, of shared forms that form overall a huge matrix that affects our access to the world. So the imaginary is the social imaginary, especially, is something effectively laden and playing a crucial role in how a human being will experience the world and the self. So the imaginary is something that institutes an order, and in the context, it is in the context of this imaginary order that, so to say, higher level constructions like norms, ideals, paradigms, etc., start making sense. Narratives, I mean, all those things are kind of building on the humus of this, of the social imaginary. So this works like as I just said, a cognitive, a cultural humus from which more articulate cultural constructs, discourses, utopias, etc., can grow. So this understanding of imaginary, I think we can especially one especially helpful author to look into it is the Greek philosopher Cornelius Castoriadis, especially in his book, The Social Institution of the Imaginary Institution of Society, which already is quite many decades old, but very, very helpful for that. So I'm coming shortly to this notion of complexity, which I mentioned earlier. When we think about working with a culture or in a culture, or helping the spread of a culture of complexity, what I mean there is that we are always looking for the connections between all those different dimensions, social, cultural, economic, ecological, personal, and not addressing different dimensions as separate problems. And the interest lies in the complex interactions. It also means becoming more perceptive to the complex interrelations between the selves and the others, and the way worlds are shared between different selves and different others. And also in seeing the intersectional limitations which are going on. So intersectional limitations between, for example, cultural identities and or fixing cultural identities on the one hand, and fixing knowledge on the other hand, especially not just disciplinary knowledge, but what I would call a cisdisciplinary knowledge system, which is a bit kind of think of the idea of cisgender identification when you think of studies. And here I'm kind of applying that or relating that to the disciplinary knowing. Am I still connected? It looks like people are not moving.
So this is a notion that I was especially working on, which you can find in that book, Untitled Sustainability, and it's really inspired by the work of Edgar Morin. And it is this idea that this kind of qualitative complexity that we have to work with is something that requires a lot of attention to and work with ambivalences, ambiguities, and there is especially this one metaphor from Morin, which is quite helpful to get a grasp of it, which is the metaphor of a musical ear. So a musical ear which hears competitions and symbiosis and interferences and overlaps, a complex relationship between rhythms and streams and melodies, where a mind which would be what you call very brutal mind, that would not be sensible to this complexity, would maybe just recognize one single theme, one melody surrounded by noise. So this is why this qualitative complexity is something that, especially in the arts and humanities, can be worked with especially well and further developed. So this is, in short, in a very simplified way, what this sensibility to complexity is about. Maybe we can go to the next slide. I'm just going quickly because I already wasted you a lot of your time. I'm sorry for technical problems. So on the next slide, I'm just shortly relating those issues of aesthetics of complexity to some qualities of art as research, which has to do especially with exploring from the unknown, with articulating constellations of possible meanings, to work with, as I mentioned earlier, with phenomenology, with phenomenological investigations on the imagination and the imaginative processes, integrating different forms of learning, promoting an epistemological pluralism, which I think can especially work well with artistic research, and several other qualities of art as research or art-based research and artistic research, which you are of course aware of from your professional work, but which relate very well to this development of an aesthetics of complexity. One especially important thing being not to resolve contradictions, not to fall either in a Manichaean fallacy, or not to fall either in a dialectical process by which one tries to resolve contradiction, but instead to live with contradictions, to sustain them and work with them through a process which Morin, for example, talked about it in terms of what he called the dialogique, or Donna Haraway, for example, talks about staying with the trouble. So this is the kind of I think, a very special, important quality, I think. Another aspect of it is the aspect of querying perception, of having a querying process. I won't have time to discuss that one in detail today with you, but which is also interesting. So to connect aesthetics of complexity also with some of the insights we can get from queer theory. If we go to the next slide. I'm sorry, it's really technical. Anyway, so if you go to the next slide.
Sasha, it's okay.
Normally you should.
We don't rush too much. We do have some time for discussion after. So
yeah.
we're just taking. We can take some of that time there. So please feel free to be expansive.
It's very kind of you. I'm still trying to go relatively fast, not to create more chaos. Sophie. One other important aspect I wanted to mention is to think of three axes of witness, the kind of responsibility and ability of response of coming from artistic research. One of them was already mentioned. I heard it shortly when I was connected for a second in between. Someone was mentioning conviviality. And indeed, one of the axes is an axis, I would say, of conviviality, which has to do with working with a deep web of relationships, from the egocentrism to the sociocentrism, anthropocentrism, ecocentrism, and maybe even in some cases relation to the cosmos. So different really levels of relation with otherness, or different levels of community. The two other axes are spatial and temporal axes to have. So the notion of the big here, from the very local to the planetary and all the scales in between, and the temporal axis from cultural heritage, from the remembrance of the long dead to working with futures, working on futures, with speculative and reflective fiction. So the not yet born, so past, present, and future generations. And what's especially interesting is, of course, the articulation of those three axes together, and how one's work can circulate and move along those three axes at the same time. So if we go to we're already at the last slide from this official part of or what I wanted to formally present. Yes, maybe later on. I mean, I had a few extra slides, but I won't present them in details right now. The extra slides have to do with saying a little bit more about imagination and imaginaries, especially the notion. The very interesting author on those two terms is Kathleen Lennon, who worked a lot on imagination and the imaginary. There's one book at Routledge, which is a very good introduction to it, and also. Saying a bit more, I could say a bit more about what social imaginaries are following Castoriadis and also some other authors who looked into it. And in my own case, I've been looking into different imaginaries of sustainability within sustainability research, and that's one of the very last slides you have. I think it's page 17, where one can see imaginaries that connect more to the mainstream, mainly technocratic and neoliberal social imaginaries, and some other three other imaginaries which are different alternatives to this dominant imaginary of sustainability, which different people, both researchers and activists and artists, are working with. So there's also a publication about that from 2019 where I was discussing that in a bit more detail. Yeah, so that will be all for now. I will just now be happy to listen to the conversation and hopefully still stay connected at least through the phone. And I thank you again for your patience despite all these technical problems on my side.
It's totally fine. It's been great to have you with us, Sacha, and considering some of these, again, insights into the diversity of sustainability within sustainability research within sustainability research as well. So they're certainly sparking a lot of interest, I think, in the ways that we even research this space and how we do that in a way that's I guess, integral to the kinds of concepts that we're engaging with today around complexity, the time-space dynamic, and being present and curious about what this asks us as educators, as researchers, and as people moving forward at this particular time in human history.